A certain German chancellor has lost his head. He's going to get a headache somewhere else instead, and he will be retiring very soon to join a certain Kaiser down in Doon. Adolf, you've bitten off much more than you can chew. Come on, hold your hand out. We're all fed up with you. God blimey. Adolf, you toddle off, and all your Nazis too. Or you may get something to remind you of the old red, white, and blue.
Okay, we're here today on June 25th, 2010. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Cranston Rogers, and I was born in South Carolina, but grew up in Orlando, Florida, and was entered the service by having graduated from high school in June of 1943. And at that time, you had to register for the draft when you turned 18, which I did before I finished high school because that's how my birthday fell. But they allowed you to finish high school, which I did do, and graduated in June of 43 and went right into the Army. When you're drafted, you had no choice. If you could enlist in the Navy if you went in before you turned 18, or the Marine Corps. But I chose to wait to be drafted because I felt the Army was as good a way to serve as any. But I took the Army General Classification test at the time I registered for the draft, which you have to do when you do turn 18, and scored high enough on the AGCT test, which is a general intelligence qualification test, to be accepted into what they call the Army Specialized Training Program, which was basically a program to send kids, students, to college to take all fields of engineering. There were some medical and some veterinarians and some language experts in that mix. But I chose civil engineering and was accepted into that program. So I knew that the requirements for that program required you to take basic infantry training as soon as you went into the service, which I did in the summer of 43.
What motivated you to join the service?
Well, everybody, I felt, all young people my age knew about the war. Of course, the Germans first the Japs attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 41, and that set the stage. We declared war, so we knew we were at war 2 years before we graduated. And as young Americans, the whole country was literally at war, and felt that the proper thing to do was perform military service. About a third of my high school graduating class, the men, had volunteered basically to Navy and Marines, and I was satisfied with serving in the Army, but did not realize I would end up serving in the infantry because we had qualified for the ASTP program.
How did your parents feel about the military and joining and the possibility of going to war?
Well, I think they were in the whole picture. My father was a veteran of World War I, and he even tried to enlist. Well, he was hoping to be accepted as a major,
yep,
but didn't make it because of physical problems. But nonetheless, he was gung-ho to get in the service. His younger brother was in the service as a reserve officer, and my other male cousins were all in some, those that were old enough had already made some commitment and were in the service.
So after you joined the service, was there any culture shock on your part from meeting people from all over the country?
Well, there were a lot of interesting aspects. I wouldn't call it a cultural shock. It was interesting meeting kids from Chicago that had never been out in the woods before, and
Yep.
even men who had never, or young men who had never even seen a cow. Those were kind of, if anything, a cultural shock. But no, it was interesting meeting younger people, boys my age from other parts of the country.
How can you walk me through basic training? How did you, after you were drafted, how did it walk me through the process of coming into the service?
Well, in some ways that was a cultural shock because some of the enlisted cadre that we faced were not well educated, and yet they were ordering us what to do, and it really took advantage of us as young soldiers in the introduction phase of getting acclimated and introduced before basic training really started. But one advantage I had was my in-depth experience with Boy Scouts, not the militaristic side of Boy Scouts, which didn't exist that way, but the living in the woods, living outdoors, and coping with outdoor problems was a great experience and preparation for military. Because some of the city kids that we met that were basic trainees with us were really more concerned because they'd never spent a night outdoors. They weren't used to being in the woods. They weren't used to navigating in the woods and that kind of thing. And so Boy Scouts, even though the Boy Scout program doesn't like to be recognized for preparing men for military service, it is an excellent, well, for many reasons, the Boy Scouts was excellent preparation for military service.
Okay, well, how long were you in basic before they actually deployed you?
Well, because we had qualified for the specialized training program, we were only 13 weeks of basic, whereas a typical basic training at that time was 17 weeks. And because I was a high school athlete, I had letters in 3 different sports in high school and really was heavy into high school athletics. Basic training was a snap. It demanded physical conditioning, and if you were in good physical condition, it was a snap almost. For instance, a 25-mile hike, some of us would trot or jog for the last couple of miles,
Yeah.
even though it was a 25th mile,
Wow.
because we were in good physical condition.
So from basic, where did you, was there a specific theater that you would have preferred to serve
Well,
in?
first right off after basic, we went to the ASTP program, and I was assigned to Texas A&M to take basic freshman civil engineering, which was mainly math at that time, and I didn't find out until many years later that Texas only had 11-year high schools.
Wow.
And therefore the math that we had at Texas A&M at that time was a repeat of my senior year in high school in Florida. And so the courses weren't even that tough. And I liked engineering because I was good at natural affinity for math and was good at math. And later became a civil engineer for that same reason. But nonetheless, Texas A&M was a good experience, but it only lasted 6 months before it was actually completely canceled because the Army needed, I'm going to use the word cannon fodder. That probably is not a good word in the minds of most people, but for us, I knew what it meant. We were going into the infantry, and of course infantry casualty rates were pretty high, but nonetheless, we knew that we were going into the infantry, and a lot of us really looked forward to it. There were only a few that were disgusted that they canceled the program that they had were looking forward to serving by finishing college, but that didn't happen. So,
Yeah. What was your rank coming into the infantry?
oh, well, we were all privates mostly. In fact, didn't matter what your rank was. If you came into ASTP, you were reduced to a private first class anyway. So we didn't get promoted. I didn't get promoted to private first class until just before we left to go overseas. And everybody that had basic training and advanced infantry training was qualified to be promoted to private first class. So I went overseas as a PFC. And I'd have to tell you that later, at the end of when the war ended, I stayed in the reserve because I did acquire rank in combat, and I didn't want to fight another war as a private. It's pretty daunting to have so many people tell you what to do in dramatic situations of combat. But I did advance later in the combat period to become a platoon sergeant, which we can talk about later as I progress.
So where are you deployed to? The Pacific Theater?
We went through advanced training after we were transferred in March of '44 to the infantry. And the division that we were in was only about 300 miles from College Station, Texas, in North Texas. We trained for 6 months and then went overseas in October of '44. We didn't know where we were going. We went by train to Camp Shanks, New York, right on the Hudson River, and then transferred to a ferry that took us to the ship, loaded on the ship, and then sailed. Didn't know where we were going. We weren't told where we were going, but we knew we were going to Europe. And we didn't know it was very dramatic until on about the 12th day at sea, all of a sudden you see the Rock of Gibraltar.
Yeah.
And you can tell you're going through the Straits of Gibraltar, so you have to know you're going into the Mediterranean.
Yep.
We landed at Marseille in France, and it took us 2 weeks to unload the ships and get all the gear together, the trucks, and all our impedimenta, they call it, together, and then we convoyed up. It was 500 miles up into central France to the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. One regiment went up on train. We went up in a motor convoy, and then into combat in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France. And it's very interesting because in my training, I grew up in Florida and trained in Alabama and Texas. And on the night we went on, the afternoon and the night we went online, it snowed 30 inches.
Wow.
And I had never seen snow before. And we lived in it for the whole winter of '44, '45. And thank goodness the American Army had excellent clothing. We didn't have the best weapons, but the Germans had better weapons in a lot of cases, but we had the best clothing. And one of the first things the Germans did when they took an American prisoner, they took his field jacket away and his boots, which they didn't have. And it was interesting how they suffered as far as that winter was concerned, because the Germans did not have good footwear.
Yep. So how did you stay motivated throughout this process?
Well, I think about that very often because I know later in life, as you grow older, things can cause you to be perplexed and maybe not feeling good or downhearted or some feeling of insecurity. But when you're young, you never think of those things. You always have you're too young to be afraid, and you haven't had enough experience to be concerned about what might happen. And we were all young, eager, gung-ho kids, and always had a positive attitude. That's why young kids make good soldiers, in my view, because only the young can really fight a war. It takes a physical stamina and the ability to persevere. And also, you have to be in extremely good physical condition. And if you are in good physical condition, you never get, well, I don't recall a time, yes, there were times when we were tired and exhausted, particularly when you hadn't had any sleep. We went 4 days one time without any sleep in terms of time set aside for sleeping. It was 4 days of constant fighting. And you may have a few hours off that you did sleep, yes, but it was not organized, and you slept when you could.
Did you have any hatred for the German people, or did any of that help motivate you to
No, I didn't. I know some of my contemporaries wanted to treat prisoners, mistreat prisoners, and I resisted. I would readily take a prisoner and happy to have him say he wanted to surrender. While I didn't really feel friendly toward the Germans, I did not feel any hatred. Only at times some hatred came out because of what I knew some of the Germans had done to Americans. But it was only in those instances that I really felt hatred. And I was only too eager to take prisoners and not to mistreat them, although I don't know that we treated them extravagantly well. We gave them, it's like a lot of guys would give German prisoners cigarettes, as an example, but
Wow.
more apt to give a French young lady a cigarette, but still, I think maybe it's just the way I was brought up. I'm not sure why. I do know that some guys, some GIs, did some really nasty things to Germans when they were caught. I wouldn't let it happen. As a matter of fact, after I became an NCO, a sergeant, and anybody that wanted to mistreat a prisoner, I would counsel him that he couldn't do that, shouldn't do it, unless the prisoner had already shown that they had done something malicious.
So tell me about your combat experiences. Where did you see action first, and from there?
Well, from the time we went online, of course, it didn't come at once because we were in a defensive position a week, and I didn't see a German soldier for the first week of combat until the day the whole division, when just like football, it has offense and defense. Well, the first offensive action we had was a week later. Unfortunately, we had a lot of men killed that day. And then the war really became serious to us because we knew that was a consequence of daily activity. But we fought all the way through the Vosges Mountains. It took us, because of the Battle of the Bulge, it took us 4 months. Maybe it was the fifth month before we really got through the Siegfried Line and into Germany. We didn't do that until, say, the 20th of March. But the Battle of the Bulge really stopped the 7th Army. We were in the 7th Army, and the 7th Army, even though the Bulge was 140 miles northwest up in Belgium, the after effects of the Battle of the Bulge more or less held us in a defensive position for the months of February and into March, all of January and all of February. We had to get resupplied, gasoline, rations, ammunition, because the Bulge had depleted all these supplies. You have to remember, we were 500 miles from ports to deliver those supplies, and all that had to be carried by truck. So we finally attacked into Germany on the 15th of March and progressed from that point all the way, we went all the way to Munich.
At this point, what was your rank in the service?
Well, I was transferred from one division to another on the 26th of January as a buck sergeant. That's the lowest rank of sergeant, and then quickly made staff sergeant to be a platoon guide, or squad leader, and then platoon guide, and then I was promoted to tech sergeant on about the 10th or 15th of April, and when I became a platoon sergeant. I had become an acting platoon sergeant off and on in March, but then more or less full-time by the end of March, and then was promoted to tech sergeant, which is a platoon sergeant's position through the end of the war.
So after the Battle of the Bulge, what was your rank? Do you remember?
Well, after the Bulge, of course, ended. See, the Bulge ended around the 7th of January, but the Germans cranked up Northwind, which started around the 10th of January, and that carried through until I was transferred to the other division on the 26th. And I went to the other unit as a senior, as a platoon guide, which is the assistant platoon sergeant's job. And I was in that position for 2 months before I became a platoon sergeant. And interesting, in the 2 full months I was a platoon sergeant, I only had a lieutenant platoon leader for maybe 5 days. I had two killed right in front of me almost. Unusual situations nonetheless, but they were killed. And I continued as the platoon leader and platoon sergeant for the entire month of April.
Wow.
And that unit ended up in Munich after we liberated, by the way, the Dachau concentration camp. We liberated Dachau on the 29th of April and went into Munich the next day, the 30th of April. And then the war ended on the 7th of May.
Did the liberation of the concentration camp bring any extra motivation to you through fighting? Or?
Well, it was very dramatic because it showed us something that we had not seen, and this was when we got into Dachau. We found 29 boxcars of dead bodies. Now, none of us knew how those bodies got there or what caused it at the time, but we knew that the Germans had to be responsible for that in some way or another. And it turned out that those people had been loaded up from Buchenwald, another concentration camp, just before Buchenwald was liberated. And then those trains were moved out, and this one happened to be moved to Dachau, so that roughly 20 days later, that train was at Dachau, and the 2,300 dead bodies on it were the residue of 4,000 prisoners that had been loaded alive on the 8th or 9th of April. And when it got to Dachau, there were 2,300 that had died of starvation and exposure because they hadn't been given any food. Wow. Or very meager food. And some of them were obviously, maybe a few of them may have been killed. I don't know. We didn't examine any of this. The net effect of this was for the GIs to collectively want to take revenge on the Germans. And this became a mission for us, but the colonel who was with us stopped some of the guys from killing the German guards, because the German guards stayed behind too, which was unusual.
Yeah. So, were there any specific experiences? Did you meet anyone from that had been held in the Dachau camp? That maybe?
No, I didn't meet any. Well, I did meet a lot of those that had escaped before we got in. My mission that day was to clear out, we called it, all the residences or buildings that were adjacent to the camp. And I didn't go into the camp itself until later that afternoon. But in the process of clearing a large section of the town of Dachau, we called it shaking down the houses, looking for German prisoners, or looking for German soldiers and take them prisoner. But we didn't find any German soldiers, but we did find, maybe 25. My platoon found about 25 former inmates of the camp who had escaped before it was liberated and were hiding in these German houses. And when we found them, at first we didn't know who they were, but we finally identified them as prisoners of the camp. And we couldn't speak. We didn't know they were Dutch. They happened to be Dutch, and we couldn't. It's a variation of German, but we couldn't understand. We could understand German, but not the Dutch-speaking prisoners. So we just concluded that because they were prisoners, we would let them go. We didn't have any reason to take control of them. We just let them stay in the house, and sooner or later, other troops coming through would take care of them. But the mission of our unit was to take Munich. So we were kind of hustled out and kept on going another 25 miles southeast to Munich itself. But Munich, although we had quite a bit of problem earlier with towns like Aschaffenburg and Nuremberg, we had no real opposition in Munich, and the city fell in one day.
In terms of problems, what do you mean? Just soldiers resisting, or?
Well, in Aschaffenburg, we had a whole German, maybe 10,000 Germans were organized and held the town of Aschaffenburg. This started the 28th of March, just after we crossed the Rhine, and it took us 7 days to take Aschaffenburg, and my regiment lost 50 men killed, fanatic Germans. The place was bombed all to hell, and artillery, and there were probably 10,000 German civilians killed with all the bombing and artillery fire. But nonetheless, that was a problem, and that was a result of their foolishly holding out, so to speak, refusing to surrender for 7 whole days. And we had to take the whole city house by house. In fact, my platoon took the last bastion of any resistance at a huge, well, I call it looked big, a schoolhouse, stone schoolhouse. And the first time we attacked that building, my platoon leader and his runner were both killed.
Wow.
And the whole reason I wasn't killed, but I fell on my face as I was climbing up, running up a pile of bricks that had been bulldozed up in the street so the street would be clear for passage. The Germans had done that, but in climbing that pile of bricks and running, I fell on my face, and even my rifle went almost down the other side, but I obviously had stopped, but the lieutenant kept on going, and he and his runner were killed before they got to the bottom of the pile of brick. And I stopped everybody from moving, and then 2 hours later, the lieutenant had us move around a block to the left and then come back from the other side and attack the schoolhouse from the other side, and no resistance then 2 hours later. And we took the whole schoolhouse, and there were over 80 German soldiers in that building, plus another 25, 30 German civilians who were obviously, possibly family members of the German soldiers, I don't know. But anyway, German civilians along with soldiers in that schoolhouse.
How did you feel once the town was liberated, knowing that it was your efforts at the very end that...
Well, of course, this is now, by the time we took the schoolhouse, that was the 3rd of April, and other troops were already another 100 miles into Germany, to show you how unrealistic it was for them to hold out like that. Also, another very interesting thing, very dramatic. When the fighting stopped, after we took that schoolhouse, some of my men were wandering around and they found a German lieutenant had been hung by his neck from a sign on the street. And we found out later that he had suggested to his commander that they surrender. And the German commander had him hung for insubordination. And he was left as an example to the Germans for having suggested that they surrender. But yet, one of my guys cut him down, and then his picture laying on the street with his hands tied was left with a picture in Time magazine showing him. I later was able to get a picture in 2005 when I went back to Aschaffenburg and into a library where there's some research material, found a whole book had been written about this, and the last chapter showed this person was a hero to the Germans, and his picture appeared in this book, and also a picture of him hanging, which is what the Time magazine wanted, but they didn't get the picture of him hung. He was laying on the ground.
So they had the picture.
It's just an interesting situation that occurred, and as I said earlier, I was only interested in as long as they surrendered. I didn't care what, unless they'd done something to something bad to Americans. I was only too happy to have them surrender.
So knowing that your lieutenant and his running man had been killed and countless other American soldiers, how did that make you feel when you'd finally completed your mission?
Well, I've often thought about that because you tell the story of your experiences, and my experience was that I was lucky that if I had kept on running, hadn't fallen, it was purely an act of you fell down, but it was a pile of brick, not very stable, and I was just lucky that I fell, and I had lost another lieutenant earlier, and when we went, just before we went to the Siegfried Line, when the Germans attacked, we attacked the Germans, I'm sorry, and he got hit in the stomach with a bullet wound and was being tended to by a medic, but both he and the medic were later killed by a Panzerfaust that had been dropped. Panzerfaust is the same as our bazooka, and they fired it in a trajectory that made it simulate a mortar. And when it landed near him and the medic who was tending him, it killed them both. And
wow.
Those are things that I think about because anything can happen in war, and I guess over a period of time you have a lot of experiences that are unusual.
So did those experiences help motivate you to carry through the war to the very end, fighting?
Yes, I only once in the whole combat period, only once did I lose my, you might say, my composure. The night that we went into Aschaffenburg, or we started the first night of the 7 days, I was told by my company commander to get my platoon and guard the bridge that we had crossed the Main River, which was just west of Aschaffenburg, and it's how we got to their side of the river, with the whole regiment lining up on their side of the river, and attack the city from that position. But the lieutenant told me to get my men together and dig in, get good positions, because the Germans were sending an entire panzer division to take that bridge and destroy it. Well, of course, and he told me, you're going to be the last ditch defense. kind of a grim situation he presented, and it took me a few minutes to, maybe 20 minutes to recover. I initially got so, I was really scared, but I quickly shook it off. But it was interesting how for a few moments I couldn't even go out and talk to my men. I was really, well, by this time I'd been in combat 6 months. And as time went by, you finally realize your time's going to come sometime. You've been lucky up until now, and sooner or later, law of averages is going to catch up to you. So all of those things were playing in my mind, and I did lose my composure for a few moments, and maybe 5, 10 minutes. I was kind of not fit to be able to talk to my men, but I quickly straightened it out and was able to get my composure back.
Well, what helped you to regain your composure?
Well, I just realized there wasn't anything I could do. I mean, it was useless to feel insecure. I don't know. It was the only time I ever, but it did. It momentarily stunned me when he told me, "You're going to stay there." Of course, at that time I was a sergeant, and he just says, "Sergeant, you're going to stay there until the last man," is just the way he said it. But it was just one of those things of, you knew that over all these many periods of close things happening, unusual, and close calls, you may call them, that you've had your share of them, and sooner or later they're going to get you. But anyway, that was the only time, and we still had another. From that moment, which was probably the 29th of March, we had another 6 weeks of war, and I never felt any kind of feeling like that again.
Well, walk me through the last 6 weeks as far as combat experience goes. Where did you guys go, and
well,
where
in
did you end up?
Aschaffenburg, we had several rather grim days of hand-to-hand, not hand-to-hand, but very close combat, where the Germans may be only 25 feet away from you in a house across the street, or you were attacking a house and throwing hand grenades through the windows and then going in to clear the house. There's a lot of close, no hand-to-hand, but a lot of close combat situations, and that took place for 3 or 4 days, and we did lose. We had 6 or 8 men killed in our company. As I said, there were 50 men killed in the regiment. And then after Aschaffenburg, we didn't have any problems until Nuremberg. There were a couple of incidents along the way going down to Nuremberg. I remember walking into a house that had not been cleared. I didn't realize it, but I walked into a house looking for some of my men, and the only thing I had with me was my pistol, and here's a German shaving in a room.
Wow.
And turns out that there were 3 or 4 other armed Germans in the house, but we were able to get them. Things like that. Then in Nuremberg, we had some street fighting just for a few days. Oh, well, and also in Nuremberg, we set up a roadblock so that Germans who were in center Nuremberg were taking off, driving east on an Autobahn, like our interstate highway. We set up a roadblock on the east side of Nuremberg. My platoon with a tank, an American tank. And we stopped at least 50 vehicles, some in a car, some in a truck, and we would stop the vehicle and take whoever was in the vehicle prisoner. And we had no incidents of anybody refusing to surrender, because once we stopped them, I had 8 or 10 men leveling rifles at them, and we had a tank ready to blast the truck if they didn't stop.
Yep.
But we had set up this roadblock all night long and captured over 100 Germans that were, in essence, fleeing out of center Nuremberg. It was a very interesting situation. So the next morning, we had over 100 German prisoners from all these vehicles that we'd stopped on a roadblock, just like you stop anybody on 495 here. They were totally unsuspecting.
Yep.
We didn't have any other real. Well, one night we had a little fight to get into a village that the Germans hadn't evacuated. But there was no serious fighting after Nuremberg. Although we actually had an assault crossing of the Danube River, but nobody got hurt, and there was no actual infantry contact, but we do know that there were Germans had been available, and one of the advantages that we had were the high dikes on both sides of the river. As we crossed, there was nobody that was able to fire at ground level because of the dikes on both sides of the river. The Danube at that point flowed through dikes that were maybe as much as 20 feet higher than the water level.
Sure. So, walk me through the end of the war as far as your experiences, maybe not just battle, but how did the war end for you?
Well, we were in in Munich on the day of May 1st. And it was quiet. There was no German. There had been a little small arms fire, but no fighting that we experienced. And the whole division was in Munich, all regiments, and there could have been part of the 42nd Division was with us. And they told us we would stay in Munich until the war ended. Well, the war ended 8 days later on the 8th of May, and we stayed in Munich until the 13th of June. And so one of the biggest problems were displaced persons and former Russian prisoners who were released from prisoner of war camps, and the Russians didn't take control of them men, they just let them run loose. So these Russian ex-POWs became a real problem in Munich because they felt they had a right to go into German houses and kill Germans and take their homes and rape women and everything. And we had to stop them as policemen, had to act as police. They were the biggest problem we had in Munich after the war, was control of Russian ex-prisoners of war.
Were they violent people?
Yes, they used weapons, and they were disgusted with us because we prevented them from killing Germans. They thought they had a right to kill Germans, and the Russians were great for throwing Germans out of their house and just living in the house. Well, they couldn't do that. I mean, we arranged to have Germans leave their house and leave the house to us to live in it. But we didn't wreck the house or destroy anything. We lived in German houses. Actually, they were 4-story. We lived in these same 4-story apartment houses for about 6 weeks. And the Germans who had been living there when we came into Munich were simply told they were given 3 hours to get their personal belongings and get out. And then we lived in those houses. They were apartments. And my platoon had one entire apartment building of maybe 8 apartments that my platoon of 35 men lived in. And actually, it was just a great time the war is over, we're alive. Of course, it's a lot of heavy drinking with partying.
Yeah.
I was, as a young, well, I was only 20 years old, and 20 years old, and I'd only tasted liquor and had something to drink on maybe 2 or 3 occasions, and I didn't have anything in Munich. I don't recall it now. I don't think I had, well, I must have had a drink a couple of times, but anyway, also I got a furlough to England. I had the longest time on line of any man in my platoon, and apparently everybody in that situation qualified for a furlough, and so I got a choice to either go to London or to the Riviera. And we landed in the Riviera, so to speak.
Yep.
It wasn't all the glory of the Riviera with bikinis. Bikinis hadn't been invented then, by the way. But anyway, I chose London, and it took me took me 3 weeks to go and come back for 7 days in London, which was a very interesting trip. It's also interesting, I guess, because I ended up meeting my wife, my first wife, and we later married. We married in '46, but I had met her on the trip to London. And I also got to go to Paris on the way back from London, so I had a nice visit in Europe. And when I got back, I found out we were slated to go to Japan because the war hadn't ended in the Pacific. And we were slated to go to Japan. And when I got back, I was immediately made the first sergeant of the company. So I'd gone overseas as a private, and now I came back as the first sergeant of infantry, which is, well, you think about it now, it may be something remarkable, even if I do say so myself, but I can tell you it was a lot of luck, because I'm lucky. I really feel lucky to be alive, and that I was allowed to live a full life, because there were 45 men in my company that were killed out of only 150 total that were in the fighting element of the company. Gives you some idea of the opportunity, if you want to look at it that way, of the averages not being so good to stay alive. But yeah, that's war, and that's maybe what, none of these things I thought about then. So it wasn't anything that occupied our minds as young kids. And as I said, we're lucky we were young, resilient. We were too young to be afraid. And that's the best part of having to have fought. That lucky that we got through it, but not affected in any mind way. In fact, much of the thoughts, some of these thoughts didn't even develop until 50 years later. So
at this point in your life, did you have any animosity towards the German people, or maybe towards the Japanese
no,
people?
I really didn't. And at that time we were still fighting the Japanese, and well, I think I had more animosity toward the Japanese than the Germans, because I knew the German people themselves were not as militaristic as the Japanese were. The average German was not an SS trooper nor a Nazi. Now, I know all of them denied it, but and some of them were avid Nazis, but not the average German. In fact, an interesting experience, my best friend in high school was a German American who was born in Brooklyn on his way to Florida, his mother and father. And he served in Germany after the war and sat in the living room not far from Aschaffenburg, by the way, in the summer after the war ended, with his first cousin talking to his grandmother who had never left Germany. And she was talking to two of her grandsons, one who fought for the Germans in Russia. The other grandson was an American, a German American, who had fought the Germans. And both of them were now visiting her in her living room in Germany. It's an amazing situation. I have nothing but respect for the Germans. A very, I think, a great country of people. They just got caught up with the wrong guy. Yep. And shows you what democracy can do, that how Hitler could take command of an entire country when he only had a 10% plurality when he became Chancellor of Germany.
It's amazing. So, as far as the end of the war, how did you feel towards your superiors and the job that they had done throughout the course of the war?
I had nothing but great respect for virtually every single one. In fact, I've now written a piece in my capacity as the newsletter editor of my division newsletter that I really feel that we had a great cadre, a great series, great group of officers, and our division performed exceedingly well. And I attribute it to the fact that we had a lot of well-trained cadre. They were all reserve type people. They were not active duty. And I think it shows the fact that this country can mobilize quickly with the attitude that our people have about freedom, of our American freedoms, that we can make good soldiers and really display extremely competent military units without extensive training. And this is another view that I have, that it doesn't take, for middle and higher level intelligent people, it does not take a lot of training to become good soldiers, to be effective and be able to defend our country. Because we're going to have to be doing this more than we think, and it's instead of once every 40 years as we did in the last century, it looks like we're going to have to keep along some kind of a standing military posture forever with the way the world is going.
So what was your rank when you left the service?
A first sergeant, and interestingly, at the end of the checkout line, so to speak, when you're getting discharged, you're asked if you want to join the reserve. And after I found out what it was, I immediately signed up for the reserve because I did not want to fight another war as a private in the infantry.
Yeah.
It's a rather daunting position to be in, to be told what to do almost every minute of the day.
Yep.
At least you like the freedom of being able to tell somebody else, as long as you have the ability. But so I stayed in the reserve, and eventually I got a promotion in 1948 for what I did in Aschaffenburg of taking that last schoolhouse. I was recommended for a direct commission to lieutenant and couldn't get it in Europe because they shut them all off because the war was coming to an end in Europe. But it was offered to me in the reserve, and I took it, and eventually retired as a full colonel in the reserve.
Wow.
So,
well, Colonel, I appreciate your time today. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I guess that's it. Thank you very much.
And I enjoyed doing it.
So we're here on June 26th, 2010. And
June
can you
25th, but
all right, we'll have to do that again. So awesome.